The woods of Hollow's Edge do not whisper, they mourn. Even now, more than a century later, when the wind cuts through the black pines, it carries with it a sound like weeping. Locals say it's just the air slithering through hollow trunks. But the old ones, the ones who remember the smell of smoke and perfume mingling on the same night, know better. They call it the voices in the dark. Before the fire, before the ground split open to reveal what the roots had hidden, there stood a house, a brothel so grand and gold-lit it looked like a promise. They called it the Velvet Veil. Behind its lace curtains, the Everhart Sisters reigned with charm so intoxicating that men ruined themselves for an hour in their company, and women who came seeking work found themselves seduced by the dream of safety. But dreams have a hunger. And in the Velvet Veil, hunger was all that ever truly lived. Those who entered described laughter that turned brittle by morning, music that never seemed to come from any room they could find, and mirrors that breathed when you looked too long. Some said the sisters' beauty was unnatural, skin too pale for warmth, eyes too deep for mercy. And when the disappearances began, no one wanted to believe that the two women who brought prosperity to Hollow's Edge could also be the reason it reeked of death. The Everhart Sisters had a gift for turning fear into fascination. By the time the truth began to claw its way out of the earth, the whole town was already ensnared in their spell. And deep in those woods, where no birds sang and no moonlight reached, their secret waited, still whispering, still hungry. In the winter of 1872, the town of Hollow's Edge was little more than a cluster of shacks clinging to the edge of a vast and uncharted forest. The air carried the scent of pine resin and cold iron, and the streets were slick with mud and secrets. No one remembered exactly when the Everhart Sisters arrived. One morning, they simply appeared, two women in black velvet coats stepping down from a coach that gleamed too clean for such a place. Eliza, the elder, had the poise of someone accustomed to attention. Margaret, the younger, carried herself like someone hiding behind her sister's shadow. They rented the long-abandoned inn at the edge of town, overlooking the forest, and within weeks, it was reborn into something no one in Hollow's Edge had ever seen, the Velvet Veil. From the moment its doors opened, the brothel became a magnet for the desperate, the lonely, and the curious. It glowed like a fever dream against the gloom of the woods. Oil lamps lined the veranda, and the scent of lilac and tobacco drifted through the streets at dusk. Inside, velvet drapes muffled the laughter and sighs, and music swelled from an unseen piano that played long after the last customer had gone home. The sisters promised a haven, not a house of sin. Their rules were strict: no violence, no debts, no one allowed past the second floor without invitation. It was this sense of order, this illusion of civility, that made the townsfolk trust them. But there was something unsettling in their perfection. Eliza spoke with a calmness that could silence any room, her voice low and deliberate, like a prayer or a threat. Margaret, on the other hand, rarely spoke at all. Her eyes seemed to linger too long on things that others couldn't see. Yet, when they stood together at the brothel's threshold, there was a strange harmony between them, as if their hearts beat to the same slow, measured rhythm. Within months, the Everharts became indispensable. Their business brought in money, travelers, and distraction. The miners came from the hills, the merchants from neighboring towns, and even the sheriff was said to spend his nights under the Velvet Veil's crimson lamps. But the sisters' generosity was selective. They hired only women who arrived alone, women whose pasts were frayed and easily forgotten. And though new faces appeared often, few were seen leaving. The townspeople did not question it at first. No one wanted to ruin the delicate glamour the sisters had woven. Yet, in the silence that settled over Hollow's Edge when the forest wind rose, some began to wonder if the Everharts had come seeking profit, or if they had been drawn there by something older, something already waiting in the woods. At first, the people of Hollow's Edge dismissed the sounds as tricks of the wind. The woods behind the Velvet Veil had always been strange, thick with moss and silence, the kind of silence that presses against the ribs and makes a person feel watched. But after the Everhart Sisters arrived, the forest seemed to change. The air grew heavier, the trees more gnarled, their roots twisting across the ground like veins. Then came the whispers, soft at first, barely audible beneath the rustle of branches. The woodcutters heard them most, voices that rose and fell like breathing, calling from the dark places between the trees. Some said it was the echo of women singing, faint and sorrowful, as if carried from somewhere deep underground. Others claimed the sounds were laughter, fragile, distant, but edged with pain. By the second year of the Velvet Veil's success, the whispers had become part of Hollow's Edge folklore. Children dared each other to venture past the tree lane at dusk, where they swore they could hear names being spoken, names of girls who had worked in the brothel and never returned. The drunkards at the tavern called it nonsense. The pious called it punishment. Yet no one could explain why dogs refused to go near the woods, or why the lanterns flickered and died whenever someone tried to light a path through them. Eliza Everhart would laugh when asked about it. "The forest only repeats what we feed it," she said once, smiling thinly as she poured brandy for a guest. "Every sorrow leaves a sound." Margaret, however, would turn pale at the mention of the woods. She could often be found staring through the upper windows at night, her gaze fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the garden fence. Some claimed to see her walking there after midnight, her white nightgown a ghostly blur between the trunks. It was the women of the Velvet Veil who feared the whispers most. They spoke in hushed tones of hearing footsteps outside their windows, of voices calling their names when no one was there. A girl named Ruth swore she woke one night to find the curtains breathing, as if the forest itself were pressing against the glass. A week later, Ruth was gone. Eliza said she'd left for the city, but the others knew better. The whispers in the woods grew louder after that, as if welcoming someone home. The townsfolk began avoiding the road that passed behind the brothel, walking the long way around instead, even in the rain. And though no one dared admit it aloud, they all knew the forest was no longer just listening. It was remembering. By the third year of the Velvet Veil's operation, Hollow's Edge had transformed from a forgotten settlement into a thriving pocket of wealth. Gold flowed through the saloon doors, new shops opened along the main road, and the once empty church now filled with men and women whispering prayers for fortune rather than forgiveness. All of it, in one way or another, traced back to the Everhart sisters. Eliza and Margaret had become figures of fascination and envy, their brothel the beating heart of the town's prosperity. Yet beneath the laughter and champagne, something unspoken crept through the streets, a quiet awareness that the sisters' success came at a cost no one could quite name. Their clientele grew stranger as their wealth deepened. Carriages with no insignia arrived long after midnight, their passengers shrouded in veils or heavy coats, speaking little and tipping in gold coins stamped with unfamiliar crests. No one knew where these visitors came from, but their money carried a chill, as if it had passed through too many dead hands. The brothel expanded under Eliza's careful supervision, new rooms were built, mirrors lined the halls, and a cellar was dug beneath the floorboards. Workers said it wasn't for wine. They heard hammers long past midnight, the rhythm too deliberate to be construction. As the sisters' fortune swelled, the number of women at the Velvet Veil began to shrink. At first, the disappearances were easy to overlook. A dancer fell ill and was sent away, a maid left without notice, another girl simply decided to start fresh. Eliza's explanations were always calm, her eyes unwavering, her voice like honey masking something sharp. Margaret said little, but her hands trembled more often, and she began wearing gloves even indoors. Some nights she was seen digging in the back garden, whispering to herself as if answering unseen questions. The townsfolk tried not to think about it. They had grown dependent on the Everharts, and to question their good fortune felt like blasphemy. Still, rumors spread. A trapper swore he found scraps of silk tangled in the roots near the forest's edge. A miner claimed he saw pale shapes moving between the trees, their mouths open but silent. The preacher's wife said the gold the sisters paid in tithes never shone in daylight. No one dared confront them. The sisters' charm was too intoxicating, their power too deeply woven into the town's veins. But at night, when the music from the Velvet Veil drifted through the fog and the forest whispered just beyond it, Hollow's Edge could feel it, the kind of prosperity that doesn't come from luck, but from sacrifice. It began with the coachmen. They were the first to speak of the figures who arrived long after the lamps of Hollow's Edge had gone dark. The road to the Velvet Veil was narrow and rough, hemmed in by trees that swallowed sound, but the carriages that traveled it glided silently, their wheels muffled as if the earth itself conspired to keep their passage secret. The men who drove them swore that once they reached the brothel's gates, a pale hand would appear through the window and signal them to stop. Then, without a word, the cloaked passengers would step out, their faces hidden behind veils that shimmered faintly in the lamplight, and disappear through the brothel's front doors. None ever emerged. The coachman would wait, sometimes until dawn, and when they knocked to inquire, Eliza Everhart herself would answer, calm and smiling, her eyes reflecting the lantern flame in a way that made them avert their gaze. The townsfolk soon noticed the pattern. On nights when those carriages came, the air around the Velvet Veil seemed to pulse, the laughter quieter, the music lower, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Sometimes, faint murmurs could be heard through the shutters, words in a language no one recognized, rhythmic and harsh, like chanting. A farmhand walking home one night swore he saw the shadows of the cloaked figures moving across the upstairs windows, their outlines too long, their gestures unnatural. When he returned the next morning to prove his story, the curtains were drawn tight, and the sisters greeted him with a politeness so chilling he never spoke of it again. Margaret grew thinner during those nights, her eyes hollow, her movements jerky, as if she were sleepwalking through her own life. The women who worked there whispered that after the visitors came, the sisters would vanish into the cellar until dawn, and strange smells, iron and smoke and something sweetly rotten, would drift up through the floorboards. One girl claimed she saw Eliza carrying a silver basin filled with dark liquid, her expression serene, almost reverent. Another heard low sobbing coming from the parlor, followed by laughter that wasn't human. By spring, even the bravest men refused to approach the brothel after sunset. The coachman stopped accepting fares to the Velvet Veil, saying the road had become cursed. Yet still, the cloaked visitors came, walking now instead of riding, their shapes gliding through the fog like fragments of shadow. And each time they entered that house, a new chill settled over Hollow's Edge, as if the forest itself shuddered in recognition. Clara Dane was not the kind of woman easily frightened. She had delivered babies in thunderstorms, stitched wounds for miners too poor to see a doctor, and once walked 5 miles through the woods at night to save a fevered child. She was known in Hollow's Edge as the town's midwife and its quiet conscience, the one person who refused to look away when others chose silence. So when the disappearances around the Velvet Veil began to multiply and whispers turned to dread, Clara decided to find out what the Everhart sisters were hiding. She claimed it was for the missing girls, but those who knew her best suspected it was also for something else, an old guilt that still haunted her, a patient she couldn't save years before the sisters arrived. Clara began her investigation gently, under the guise of her trade. She offered her services to the women at the brothel, tending to their ailments and bringing them herbs for sleep. It gave her reason to move freely through the halls, to observe, to listen. She noticed things most overlooked, the way the mirrors in the upper rooms seemed to hum faintly when touched, the faint smell of earth that clung to the sisters' clothes, and the strange absence of anyone who claimed to have seen the cellar. At first, Eliza appeared warm, grateful even, but her eyes followed Clara too closely. Margaret avoided her altogether, retreating to her chambers whenever Clara entered, whispering to someone unseen behind closed doors. One night, Clara stayed later than usual. A storm was rolling in, and the forest outside thrashed like a living thing. As the lamps flickered, she heard faint cries beneath the floor, soft, desperate, distinctly human. When she pressed her ear to the boards, the sound stopped. Then, from somewhere behind her, Eliza's voice, calm, almost tender. "Curiosity, Miss Dane, is the only sin without redemption." Clara never returned home that night. The next morning, her small cottage stood empty, her bed unslept in, her medical bag missing. Search parties scoured the forest for days, but the rain had washed away every trace of her. Only her blood-stained bonnet was found, tangled in the roots of an old willow near the edge of the Everhart's property. The sisters claimed to know nothing, their grief perfectly performed, their composure unbroken. But after Clara's disappearance, the laughter from the Velvet Veil grew louder, sharper, echoing deep into the woods. And sometimes, when the wind rose at night, the townsfolk swore they could hear her voice among the whispers, pleading, warning, or perhaps simply remembering. The storm that tore through Hollow's Edge that autumn was unlike any the town had known. It came without warning, no flicker of lightning on the horizon, no scent of rain in the air, only a sudden, violent wind that bent the trees as if something enormous were pushing its way through the forest. Roofs split, fences shattered, and by morning, the fields were littered with broken limbs and the damp scent of decay. When dawn finally came, the townsfolk emerged to find the Velvet Veil still standing, untouched, its windows gleaming as if freshly polished. But behind it, along the slope where the forest began, the earth had shifted. A landslide had torn through the edge of the garden and unearthed what the Everhart sisters had buried. It was a child who first saw it, a pale, thin hand reaching out from the mud. By the time the sheriff arrived, the rain had washed away more of the soil, revealing bones tangled in lace, scraps of fabric clinging to them like dead flowers. There were more than one, the ground was full of them. Dozens of shallow graves lay scattered beneath the trees, some still marked by stones that might once have been crosses. The smell was unbearable, the air heavy with the damp sweetness of rot. The sheriff ordered the area cleared, but word spread faster than command. By noon, the whole town had gathered at the edge of the property, their faces pale and silent. Eliza stood on the veranda as they worked, her expression unreadable. She claimed the graves predated their ownership, remnants of old settlers or travelers lost to the woods. Her voice was calm, persuasive, almost soothing, and for a moment, some wanted to believe her. But Margaret could not hide her trembling. She hovered near the garden fence, eyes darting between the unburied bones and the dark line of the forest, her lips moving soundlessly as if reciting names. When a deputy tried to approach her, she screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that sent birds flying from the trees. That night, the townsfolk lit candles in their windows, though few dared to sleep. The graves were left open, guarded by men who swore the earth moved after midnight. Some claimed they saw faint shapes wandering between the trees, women in tattered dresses, their faces lost to shadow. By morning, the soil had shifted again, smooth as though it had swallowed itself. The bones were gone. And though no one dared return to that spot, every rain that followed carried with it the same foul smell, as if the forest refused to let the dead rest beneath its roots. It was the preacher who found it, though he never meant to. Reverend Silas Moore had gone to the Velvet Vale under the pretense of offering prayer for the dead after the storm, but in truth, he was drawn by something darker. Guilt, curiosity, and the faint, unholy fascination that had infected everyone in Hollow's Edge. The Everhart sisters received him with politeness sharpened to a blade's edge. Eliza offered tea, Margaret stared at the floor. He stayed only a few minutes, yet as he left, he caught sight of a small, leather-bound book half hidden beneath a velvet cushion. Something in him, perhaps fear, perhaps faith, made him take it. He slipped it beneath his coat and did not open it until the church bells tolled midnight. The book was Eliza's journal. Its cover was stained with something dark, its pages unevenly cut, as if trimmed by trembling hands. At first, it seemed ordinary, entries written in a precise, elegant script detailing daily affairs, financial notes, and brief reflections on the women in their employ. But as he read on, the tone shifted. Words twisted into symbols, sentences looped into spirals, and beneath the ink, faint indentations marked where another pen had pressed hard enough to tear the paper. She wrote of voices beneath the soil, of dreams filled with pale faces, and of something she called the mother beneath the roots. There were prayers too, though not the kind Reverend Moore knew, pleas written backward, invocations to be heard by the hollow ground. As he read further, the ink seemed to darken, almost pulsing in the candlelight. Eliza described rituals performed under the new moon, gatherings in the cellar where the air thickens and the walls breathe. She wrote of feeding the soil to keep it still, of offerings wrapped in silk and bone, and of a hunger that wears many faces. The last entries became frantic, her handwriting collapsing into jagged strokes. She claimed the forest was listening, that it demanded its due, and that Margaret had begun to hear the same whispering voices. The final page bore only a single sentence written in red, "She is waking." The preacher shut the book and fell to his knees, but the prayers that rose from his lips felt hollow. By morning, he was gone from Hollow's Edge, leaving only a note for the sheriff and the journal locked inside the church's altar. The note read, "Do not let them sing again." When the sheriff broke open the altar the next day, the journal was gone, and the earth outside the church doors was soft, as though someone had dug there during the night. It began on the night of the harvest moon, when the air was thick with mist and the smell of rain lingered though no clouds hung above. The people of Hollow's Edge had grown restless since the preacher's disappearance. The Everhart sisters kept to themselves, their windows shuttered, their lamps dark. Yet just past midnight, a sound rose from the woods behind the Velvet Vale, a low, haunting hum that wove through the trees like smoke. At first it was mistaken for the wind, but then the notes took shape. It was singing. Soft, mournful, impossibly human. The melody carried across the town, familiar in a way that made stomachs twist and hearts stutter. Mothers who had lost daughters, lovers who had buried sweethearts, all swore they knew those voices. They were the voices of the missing. The song grew clearer as the night deepened, a harmony of sorrow that seemed to call names in the pauses between verses. Windows opened, lanterns flickered to life, and the people stood in the streets listening, frozen. Some wept. Others fell to their knees. But when a few brave souls followed the sound into the forest, the air changed. The trees grew closer together, and the path turned to mud slick with something that gleamed faintly under the moonlight. They found no singers, no footprints, only the faint echo of laughter, soft and wet, like the sound of breath through water. By dawn, the singing stopped, leaving the woods silent once more. Over the following weeks, the songs returned, always at the same hour, always louder. Each time, more people claimed to hear the words clearly, promises, laments, fragments of lives stolen too soon. And each time, someone new went missing. A farmhand vanished while chasing the sound. A widow walked into the trees and never came out. The sheriff posted guards, but by the second night, they had fled, babbling about shapes moving between the trunks, pale and swaying, their mouths open but their eyes hollow. Inside the velvet veil, the women began to lose sleep. They said the songs seeped through the walls, that they could hear familiar voices calling from the garden. Margaret stopped eating altogether, standing at the upstairs window for hours, humming along to melodies no one else could hear. Eliza grew colder, quieter, as if the songs were meant for her alone. One night, a witness swore he saw her walking barefoot into the woods, her white gown glowing faintly, her lips moving in perfect time with the voices. The next morning, the song returned, richer, fuller, another voice added to the chorus of the dead. By the time winter returned to Hollow's Edge, Margaret Everhart was no longer the woman the town had once admired. The younger sister who had once stood in Eliza's shadow now drifted through the corridors of the velvet veil like a ghost, her beauty hollowed out, her eyes wide with sleepless terror. The laughter that once filled the brothel had faded into uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of her muttering. At first, the women who worked there believed she was praying, but her words were too broken, too frantic, spoken to someone no one else could see. She would stop mid-sentence, tilt her head as if listening, then smile faintly, whispering, "Yes, I hear you." Eliza tried to hide her sister's unraveling. She dismissed the servants who spoke of it and forbade anyone from entering Margaret's room. But the changes could not be concealed. Doors began slamming on their own, mirrors cracked without cause, and the scent of damp earth crept through the halls. Margaret's footprints, bare and smeared with mud, were found on the stairs each morning, leading toward the back garden where the graves had once been uncovered. Some nights, the women awoke to the sound of digging, slow, deliberate, the scrape of a spade biting through frozen ground. When they looked from the windows, they saw her kneeling in the snow, her hands buried deep in the soil, her lips moving as though comforting something beneath. Rumors spread quickly through Hollow's Edge. Some said the guilt had driven her mad, others whispered that she was possessed by the spirits of the women buried behind the house. The truth, perhaps, was worse. Margaret began speaking of the ones below, claiming they were restless, hungry, and calling her name. She said they wanted to be free, that Eliza had promised them peace but never kept her word. When Eliza confronted her, witnesses claimed the argument shook the walls, the elder's voice sharp with fury, the younger's trembling with hysteria. It ended with a scream that echoed through the night, followed by silence. The next morning, Margaret appeared at breakfast calm and smiling, her hair neatly brushed, her eyes distant. She told the remaining women that the digging was over, that the voices had quieted. Yet later that day, a maid found her in the parlor speaking to an empty chair, tears glistening on her cheeks as she whispered, "They said it won't stop until the fire." From that night on, the women refused to stay inside after dark. Margaret's laughter could be heard from the garden long past midnight, mingling with a faint chorus rising from the woods, a sound that made even the wind hesitate. The fire began on a night when the sky hung low and bruised, the air so still that even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. It started, they said, just after the clock struck 3, a single spark that bloomed behind the windows of the velvet veil and then devoured the building in minutes. By the time the townspeople reached the hill, the brothel was a roaring pyre, its velvet curtains curling into ash, its golden chandeliers collapsing in bursts of molten light. The flames reached high enough to stain the clouds, and within that blaze, some swore they saw shapes moving, women twirling in slow, graceful circles as if dancing in the fire, their laughter mingling with the crackle of burning wood. Eliza Everhart stood at the top of the steps, her face illuminated by the inferno, calm and radiant. She did not scream, did not run. She simply watched as everything she had built was consumed. No one saw Margaret. Some claimed she started the fire herself, that guilt had finally driven her to destroy what her sister refused to relinquish. Others insisted she was already dead, buried somewhere beneath the brothel. When the roof caved in and the smoke turned black, Eliza vanished into it. The fire burned until dawn, and when it was finally extinguished, there was nothing left but a pit of smoldering ruin and the faint smell of perfume clinging to the ashes. The townsfolk began to dig through the debris, hoping to recover bodies, but what they found instead was a trapdoor buried beneath the charred remains of the parlor. The entrance led to a narrow staircase spiraling deep underground, carved from the very earth. The air below was damp and cold, filled with the scent of soil and something older, something alive. Lanterns flickered as the men descended, their light trembling against the walls where strange markings had been carved, symbols like those from Eliza's journal. The passage stretched on longer than it should have, winding beneath the forest, leading to a vast chamber where the ground pulsed faintly as though it were breathing. At its center lay a hollow of roots, black and tangled, and from within came the faint sound of whispers, soft, pleading, countless. The men fled, dropping their lanterns as they ran. By the time others returned to seal the passage, the entrance had vanished, swallowed by the earth. Only the scorched foundation of the velvet veil remained, and when the wind passed through its ruins, it carried voices that did not belong to the living.